Joining us tonight for this RTS Technology Center event on sustainability. So I'm really pleased to be invited to host this panel. We've got three brilliant panelists joining us tonight who all bring very different perspectives on this really important topic. So before we start, just a short introduction on me. I'm Dee Davison. I've been working in film and TV for over 20 years in both the commercial and public sectors. Most recently, I was the Global Director for Sustainability at Deluxe. And now I'm a freelancer and consultant in sustainability, working in film and TV, as well as with quite an exciting new green tech startup called Climate Gains. So before I introduce the panel, I wanted to clarify some of the boundaries of this discussion in that sustainability, big S sustainability, in its fullest sense, includes environmental, social, and economic principles. So all of those are really critical, of course, to having a truly sustainable future. But what we're talking about here is just the environmental dimension of sustainability, which in itself is a huge topic, of course. So before we dive into the discussion, I'm going to invite the panel members to introduce themselves, to say a little bit about their current role, and to share a short story or anecdote about sustainability that can get our minds in gear for the hour ahead. So, Rohan, I'm going to go to you first.
Oh, thanks, Dee. Hi, I'm Rohan Mitchell. I'm the Group ESG Director at EMG. EMG are a global broadcast solutions facilities companies, lots of outside broadcast studios, etc. And I'm a little anecdote. My kids still don't know that their spag bowl that they have regularly on a Monday night is meat-free. They still think it's free, and that's that. So the meat-free Mondays we've been doing for years, and they still have no idea, which is great.
Good for you. I'll get the recipe, please. Matt.
Hi there, I'm Matt Scarff. I'm the MD for BAFTA Albert. We're the home of environmental sustainability for the screen industries. You may have heard of us. Quite a few people around the world have, I'm really pleased to say, and I've been in the role officially since January, but I did a slight interim 3 months to test the water, and so I've been here since October. Yeah, lovely to meet you all.
Thanks, Matt.
Oh, do you want my story?
Oh, yes, please, if you have
I haven't got meat-free, although I did do meat-free yesterday. But I've been thinking about things that have inspired me over the years around sustainability, and I've just always had the sort of passion for Blue Peter and Newsround, probably because I wanted to be a presenter all those years ago. Never got there. But the thing that I think I remember most was the Thames Barrier. And as a boy, and just watching TV and being fascinated by something like the Thames Barrier just really inspired me. And I always wanted to know how things work. Probably should have been a mechanic. So I think the Thames Barrier, because the Thames Barrier is still operating today, and it's an incredibly important part of London, and even more so with what's going on with climate change.
Absolutely, thank you. Did you get a Blue Peter badge ever?
Sadly not. I did work at the BBC and tried to steal one, but it wasn't possible.
Maybe Alison can help you out with that.
Yeah.
Alison.
Hi, nice to meet you. So Alison Butler, I'm the Sustainability Manager for our Scope 3 supply chain emissions at the BBC. So I've been here just over 12 months, working closely with our wider supply chain. And prior to that, I was in the retail industry. So some very different sort of experiences to bring along, and kind of trying to think of that that story. It's almost, sort of why did I get into this role? And it was really that, at the moment, you see so many things are changing, and my children are very much aware of that, that change in the environment. So it's really that passion, drive to influence and make things, sort of better for the future. So it's really about sort of that bringing people together and making improvements.
That's great. Thank you, Alison. I can definitely relate to that.
And I've got a green Blue Peter badge. Oh. just saying.
Is there an age limit on Blue Peter badges?
I don't know.
Green one sounds very comfortable. Lovely, thank you very much for that. So, so just to sort of set the scene for the next hour, the objective of this first RTS Technology Center session on sustainability is to look at how we're doing as an industry in this area. So we're going to look at what's working well, where are the big opportunities that we can see, what's holding us back, perhaps, and also how well connected we are across the value chain on this topic. So before we start, I wanted to share a quote, which I always love doing, from the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, who I tend to seem to be quoting quite a lot. This was his quote following the publication of the 6th assessment report from the IPCC last year on climate change. And he says, if we combine forces now, we can avert climate catastrophe. The internationally agreed threshold of 1.5 degrees is perilously close. The only way to prevent exceeding this threshold is by urgently stepping up our efforts and pursuing the most ambitious path. So I guess, the way that I see it is that undoubtedly there's good momentum in our industry, but are we moving fast enough? Are we really prepared for the effects of climate change over the coming years? And not just the physical effects, such as the devastating impact of extreme weather events, but also changes in the regulatory landscape, in the availability of resources in our supply chains, in market shifts which need to happen to help us adapt to a net zero economy. And I think it's also important to point out that when we talk about net zero is not the destination here, it's a milestone. If we really want to restore our planet and keep global temperatures within that acceptable range, that's going to be a challenge that exists far beyond all of our lifetimes. So, there's a tendency to keep looking at net zero, whereas actually we should be looking at net zero being, the first milestone for many milestones ahead. So how are we doing as an industry? I think we've made great progress on and off screen, but I'd like to start by asking the panelists from their view, where is it working well? Where can we see this real progress being made? And what should we be calling out and celebrating? And Matt, even though you're very new in role, you have a different perspective perhaps coming from the TV industry in your career, but being new into this kind of whole, like being immersed in the area of sustainability as you are now. So I'm going to go to you first to say, what's your perspective here?
Thanks, Dee. That quote really resonates with me, partly because I think Albert's reason for existing is to convene and collaborate and bring people together, working together for the better. And that's what Albert's been doing for almost 12 years, I think. Started by the BBC and now owned and operated by BAFTA. It works with the industry. It's been mainly focused on television, but with a view to looking at film now and potentially gaming to align with BAFTA's ways of working too. I think that my experience has been, and I've worked at ITV, BBC, Sky, pretty much all the major broadcasters. There are some similarities I see around sustainability and D&I, and I've talked about it actually in a couple of other forums as well. And there is that power of working together to achieve best practice at speed. And ITV, when I was working there, had a very ambitious acceleration plan around diversity and inclusion. And it got the whole business focused on it. And I think that was not only led by a brilliant CEO, Carolyn McCall, but I think the fact that everybody understood the importance of D&I within the broadcasting environment and within the media landscape, it's so similar. My feeling is it's so similar in sustainability. The conversations I'm having are often around, oh, we've tried this, you should try this. Well, why? You should tell us, because we can tell somebody else. We can sort of bring this to the next consortium meeting or TV steering group. So I think there's some real learnings that I'm bringing essentially from that D&I experience into the world of sustainability to help BAFTA Albert, but also to help those organizations that I'm working with in a different way now. So yeah, I don't know whether that sort of answers your question.
I think so, yeah. I mean, I think it's a really nice a sort of way to think about it being similar, because DEI, of course, is part of the wider sustainability when we think about all of those impacts. And I just written down together at speed. I think, almost could be a slogan that we could adopt, because that's what it's all about. We have to move faster and we have to do this together.
And it's understanding sort of what resonates, isn't it? What resonates with our audiences, because at the end of the day, we make great content, and that content can really resonate. Let's think about Mr. Bates versus the post office. It's obviously being talked about quite a lot at the moment, but it's hit a spot and people are ready to listen, whereas the last however many years people just haven't really got it. So it's thinking about the stories we're telling, and BAFTA Albert, we've got a director of climate content in Caris Taylor, and Caris is working really hard to illustrate the sort of content that will work not only with audiences, but also how, when we're presenting at COP, what are legislators, politicians, what do they need to hear? What do they need to hear from us? We've got a real opportunity to tell the story at speed, because there isn't time to mess about.
Absolutely. No, I think that what's the climate content topic is very interesting. I think that there's the research that's been done about the stories that have impact in terms of making people making people change their behaviors are not necessarily, like, the planet Earths are so important, but it's also the sort of the good news stories, or the subliminal sort of messages in everyday content that we're watching. When we went to Emmerdale, and there's the sort of nods to sustainable living in sort of more like less sort of apparent ways. So I think, and some research has been done by the University of Southampton, I think, about what resonates with audiences in that way, and it is those it's those good news stories that gives people hope, that gives people a view into how it can be done. So that's very exciting.
And I was just to finish off there, I was just thinking about thinking about the Thames barrier, that sort of like going back, how that affected me at however 10 years old, maybe younger. It still resonates with me. It's children. I think, was it the most popular word that was said last year, or by children, or was part of the I think the Oxford English Dictionary said it was climate change. Was, I mean, that's two words, but climate change was the words that of the year for 2023, right? So we've got to make it. We've got to make this happen, and it's nobody else's fault. We all have to pull together to accelerate this at speed. Again.
Absolutely, yeah. Thank you, Alison.
Yeah, I was going to say, so it's picking up those conversations around collaboration. So I work very closely with our suppliers at the BBC. So we've got 13,000 suppliers. So I think it's really, really interesting to start those conversations now. And I think that collaboration, sharing what's working well, learning from each other. I think it's having those open conversations. I think the door is open, and people are willing to start to talk about that outside of that sort of competitive world. So I think actually there's some really good examples of what's working well. It's actually, how do we share that? How do we kind of get people off on their journey? Because it's quite, it can be quite daunting. So I think it's that opportunity to kind of get people, enthusiastic, kind of, ready to go, and actually, where do they start? So I think it's, for me, it's very much about those conversations, sharing, learning from each other.
Absolutely, yeah. It's if the appetite's there for collaboration, then I mean, that's just such a good starting point, isn't it? I mean, and I think probably 2 years ago, I don't know, you tell me, but I think 2 years ago that probably wasn't there as much. It was something almost people were fearing a bit more, that they kind of thought was something kind of that was coming, but don't need to worry about it now. And now it really is present. And I think that the realization is there, and people are starting to be moving towards much more of a collaborative state. So great Absolutely. To hear that.
And I think it's that kind of, obviously you can see climate change is happening and real. So, it's, we report on it regularly. And I think it's that, it is very much really there. So people are seeing it, and it kind of really makes a real big, sort of influence and decision on what they're doing day to day. So I think it's because it's so visible and so real now, I think it's really driving change.
Good to hear. Rohan.
Yeah, well, I think I'm going to go back to really sort of BAFTA Albert, and that how from, you know, from a facilities point of view, it was really our clients saying, you know, you have got to come on this journey, you know, to be more sustainable. And this is what we've been doing over the last, you know, a lot of years, you know, when we're saying, right, okay, we need to work with each, you know, each of our clients going forward. So I'd say, you know, hats off to BAFTA Albert and Matt. So thank you on your behalf, because without that was a real sort of groundswell of what we want to do. But so actually we have to push on now, and you know, it was a great start, but actually it's for everyone within the business and within the screens industry to look at how we can be more efficient, be more sustainable. You know, when we've talked about, you know, the different green riders that we have, you know, in the screens industry, it's those sort of things. You know, we still have people, you know, traveling in separate cars, going into site for talent, all of those things. You know, we try to put stuff in, you know, because we're mainly the sports and light entertainment based, but you know, we try to put some, you know, efficiencies in, so like everyone gets their water bottle, you know, and their reusable cup, and so all of those plastics go there. You know, trying to get, you know, try to have like renewable energy on site, and how we do that. So all of these things, it's all of the you know, we're all working together to try and just become more and more efficient. But I think you're right that we have to ramp this up, because we've only begun, you know, so long, and we see the changes happening, you know, around us. So, you know, I think the other things we've seen is on you know, the climate change being discussed more on screen. And so we just had the Green Football Weekend last weekend across the country. Those sort of initiatives are really good, you know, because it's actually broadening the horizons, not just within the industry, but into the wider communities.
And it kind of brings me on to like the idea of, you know, are we doing enough? So there's all these sort of pockets of great work happening, but how do we know across the whole industry, like, is there visibility of all those good things happening? And you know, are we able to benchmark ourselves against one another fairly to see where there is good progress, and to sort of see that in a tangible way across the whole industry? I'd wonder. You know, the brief for this session asked, are we doing enough? And when I thought about that, I was thinking, well, how do we know if we're doing enough? Because I don't think there's Albert for production, which is great, and there's a very good measure for sort of, you know, a carbon footprint of a production, but it sort of stops at post stage. I think, Matt, correct me if I'm wrong. So across the whole value chain, you know, how do we make that assessment? And you know, is that what we need to do? So Alison, from your position working for a supply chain for one of the biggest companies in our industry, just interested in how you approach that. You know, you've got such a diverse group of companies to work with. How do you know what good looks like there?
Yeah, I think that's good. I'll just share my screen. So basically, what good looks like. So when we're working with our supply chain, we really encourage our suppliers to start looking at their total emissions. So to kind of get a real feel for what as an organisation are the things that, one, can you measure, but equally what can you control and what can you reduce. So we kind of talk about scopes, but it's very much about looking at the emissions that are very much in your control, so the electricity that you purchase, etc. But then sort of looking at that wider supply chain. So when we've done this at the BBC, what we've found is that the majority of our emissions are in our supply chain. So hence my role sort of very focused at looking at, you know, who do we work with, what do they do, and actually what conversations can we have. So I think it's very much really looking at, you know, that how do we work together, how do we kind of sort of move in the right direction. But I think, one, it's about measuring it but not getting stuck on that measurement route, because it can be quite complicated. And I think it's actually what things can you put in place to decarbonize, you know, sort of reduce the emissions in your organization. So very much, you know, this is just an example of the BBCs, looking at our supply chain, but equally travel. It's different for different types of organisations. Supply chain is probably a big one, but I think it's a starting point for organisations to have a look, and then actually once you can see where your the big areas are, is actually then to start to make those, sort of put things in place that you think that may make those changes. And so we've seen, people moving to renewable energy, for example, has a real shift in kind of what their footprint is, and therefore equally what the footprint is to the people that use and work with them. So I think it's sort of really starting to get going on that. So I'll stop sharing, but I thought that was just
Thank
useful
you.
to see.
And Alison, out of interest, is the approach at the moment, obviously it's collaborative, as you said, but working with the supply chain, how much is the other sustainability efforts of your vendors influencing decision making around things? Or is that because I know for a lot of people that's a journey.
Absolutely. I think it's different for different types of organisations where they are, and the size of the organisation as well. So there's a recognition that obviously smaller organisations, have different challenges to larger ones. So I think very much it's working in partnership with that supply chain. It's still very much work in progress. I think for ourselves, it's really about working with suppliers, providing information, guidance, etc. So I think there's lots of resources available. But I think for us, it's almost, can we signpost, pinpoint, provide guidance, connect people in the industry?
Thank you. And I'm just generally interested around that scope 3, 68%, because I know that's the scope 3 is often the highest for a lot of people, and definitely in our industry. How was it in retail? Was that a trend that was the same in retail?
Absolutely. It was even more. So it was around about, sort of for retail, probably around about 98% was in that area. So you think of all the products that you're buying and where are those products coming from. So really, when you look at the supply chain, and that'll be, for a lot of people that are purchasing goods, it's actually, how does that get to you? Sort of how is it transported, from around the world. So actually, sort of what we're seeing from sort of the sort of retail industry, it was very much around about the supply chain was absolutely key to that. So although people concentrate, rightly so, on the things that are in their control, the supply chain is a tricky one, but equally should definitely not be overlooked.
Absolutely, yeah. I'm sure everyone has a real role to influence that scope 3. Rohan.
So we've just finished our first ever global baseline. So I feel the pain that Alison's just showed there. I think from our experience, there's where it comes to here, we have, it's the engagement of our suppliers and our vendors, and the education piece that we need to do around it, because you're right, everyone's at different maturity levels across this space, and it's how do we bring, raising the floor of people's expectations of what we're trying to achieve. So it's, you said before, are we doing enough? I personally don't think we're doing enough, but we need to educate people to know exactly what we're trying to do. So how do we look at our business? How do we embed sort of ESG or sustainability within the core business decisions going forward? Because that's a really important thing. Any progressive company needs to have ESG within their business strategy, because without being a sustainable business, down the line, you first of you've got your legislation that going to have to adhere to, but also it's about being more efficient, so you're not wasting any resources. So that's something that we're really keen on working with the industry, whether it's up or downstream, to say, look, let's try and raise the education piece of that. What are we trying to do? What are the quick wins? I always say, we have many suppliers, or maybe just one person, but they may be a camera operator or a sound operator, and they haven't really, they haven't got maybe the resource for that. And you go, well, look at the SME hub, which is a great resource here in the UK that you can utilize to try and get some information, or it's more of like a sharing of that, across the industry. And forums like this are great, and I think we should have more of them across across the industry.
Yeah, that's a good point. Certainly, I kind of wonder sometimes because there are obviously a number of forums and panels, and there's more panels on this topic, and there's more speakers, which is great. What I'd like to see is more. What I'd like to see is more people to be speaking on this topic in front of really varied audiences. Like, I really hope, I don't know who's on the in this audience tonight, and I'm hoping that it's really varied, because often sustainability people can talk to sustainability people and we all agree and know what each other's talking about, but it's getting to the, it's getting to the decision makers, to the boards, to the C-suites, to really educate, as you say, Rowan, to start to make a difference at all levels as well. Matt, what's your view on this?
Yeah, I think there's a really interesting point around that sort of, again, diversity point, especially within sustainability. And look at us. We're all white, and we're all on the panel, and there's a mix, male and female. But I think that our stories are all different. And if we incorporate more and more stories and more diversity, we understand that the impact and what's happening to people in their world and their lives. I think it's really important. Going back to sort of, I suppose, are we doing enough as an industry? Albert's been collecting data for almost 13 years, I think, since it was conceived. And that sort of starts to build up themes and patterns. That data is incredibly valuable, actually, to the industry. And there's, I think, from the sort of pre-production part of a program, Albert's involved in that, talking to the production coordinators, producers, but it follows through to the actual final delivery, which is, when you get your sort of Albert certification. Other thing we've been doing at Albert is an Albert Studio sustainability standard. And I think the majority of studios in Wales actually have signed up to this. And this is really where we are going to be able to sort of benchmark and collect data and understand what is working, but also that as a bit of a, I suppose, a roadmap and a tool to help other studios across the United Kingdom and actually further afield as well. Albert's got this incredible brand that I'm so surprised people hear about it all. I hear about it all over the world. It's really powerful, and we can help those conversations, again, going back to that convening and collaborating. One thing that I just thought was really interesting, actually, and Alison, it was when you pulled up your scope 1, 2, 3, which when I first tried to understand scope 1, 2, and 3, it absolutely terrified me. I think Danielle was trying to explain it to me when I first went to the BBC. But there's something for me around, and maybe this is where Albert can play, a part. Every organisation you work in, it all looks different. It probably sounds similar, but imagery, how we explain it, and I think individuals haven't got the time in organisations to necessarily have to think about working it out. So I just wondered whether there's more of a common language or a common visual identity for what we do, and whether that is a sort of an Albert thing, or it's just we think about it more and we use agreed common terms and words.
Yeah, I think that's a very, very interesting point. I've always thought that it would be great to, like on a piece of content, because the thing that brings us all together, that we're all in, the whole supply chain is working on packages of content, digital files that ends up on people's screens in one form or another. And wouldn't it be great if, alongside the metadata on who the talent are and who the director is, you had metadata around what a carbon footprint of a piece of content was, but across all, from pre all the way through to exhibition. And it's all measured in the same way. I mean, how you would do that, I don't know, but it feels like there's some really good, very well validated standards. We've got Albert's, we've got the Studio Sustainability Standard, we've got the DPP Committed to Sustainability Programme. They're just in our industry, and then you've got the kind of wider ones like CDP, and but everyone might be sort of dipping into different bits. So I'd love to see at the end credits, along with the Albert stamp, the total emissions from that piece of content from cradle to grave, sort of thing. So but yeah, I agree that, and the way that visualizing it is really helpful. Seeing it on a pie chart really simply for an organization is very impactful. So yeah, perhaps there is something there in how we present the information we're all talking about.
Dee, I'm thinking you're joining one of the Albert task forces around standards, because I think that's a great idea. I mean, I think, why not,
Yeah, absolutely. Let's talk offline on that one, Matt.
All right.
Sounds very, and honestly, but standards is absolutely the way forward. And even though I completely agree with Alison, we don't need to get lost in the data here. And sometimes, I've done scope 3 for a big multinational company, and it's hard. I'm a bit of a detailed person. Naturally, it's hard not to kind of want to drill down on everything, but actually it's the order of magnitude that's important here. So we're focusing our limited resources on where we can make best impact. So thinking forwards then, in terms of, let's assume that we can measure and we can start to compare over time. What are the biggest opportunity areas where we should be focusing our efforts? How can we build on this progress that we've made? How can we drive new areas of innovation? Like, what are the biggest opportunities to be creating this momentum towards this net zero goal? And I'm going to go to Rohan first on that one. I know you've done some good work here.
Yeah, well, I think I would say that within the sports production space, there's been a real step change over the last 4 or 5 years into remote production. We've seen it was really big sports like F1 and ATP and Formula E that all do remotes. And then, broadcasters here in the UK have really been leading it as well, whether it's Sky or TNT. That's really had some tangible results, I would say. So the idea is that not everyone's traveling to site. They either have built their own studios or galleries in their own facilities or at one of the EMG's rocks, etc. And then not everyone has to travel. So it's a double-edged sword. I think it takes some of the glamour out of it, which I suppose if you were because previously I was in Formula One for a lot of years, so I travelled the world, and this is where I'm probably trying to make amends for the air miles I've had. So, but you can see there that they've saved, I think it's about 40% their emissions by people not traveling. So it's a huge positive impact on those sort of global sports. But we've seen it here, like in the UK, and we did some data over the last 4 years. We've done about 5,000, the EMG group have, of remote productions. So even if they're only saving a few hundred kilos of CO2 per event or a couple of tons, but it's still an impact, and it has those, you can leverage technology now, and that's the other thing, so this is what we're doing, whether that's a remote production or a cloud production or a simplified production, the technology is there now, so we don't have to have everyone going to site. So that's really brought some benefits.
Great. And do you feel that, when you're talking to clients about working in that way, when maybe they haven't done it before, I know that it's a sort of tried and tested practice for quite a few of the bigger broadcasters now, but is there appetite there from people to try new things and to do it in a new way?
Yeah, and I think also it's opened out, the lower tier sports that you have. So you have your tier 1 sports that we do, but the streaming stuff that we do for, so maybe, so a women's netball or a non-live rugby league or rugby union we're showing. There's lots of opportunities out there, and people now, the technology's there, so they can go there with a lot smaller equipment, a lot more power efficiency, and then they can go and they can do their production, and then that, of course, that reduces the overall footprint for that. So I think you have to be agile in this space, and this is what we're doing. Many clients have gone down that road, but there's some that still like the traditional part of that, and we still do some big on-site jobs where everyone goes to site.
I think remote production is such a good example of, not only have you got an opportunity to reduce a carbon footprint, but you're also opening up new products. When people say sustainability saves money, it actually opens up new potential commercial routes of revenue for you. So that's a great example. Thank you. Alison.
I was going to say, one of the things where we see a real change and a real shift is when people move to renewable energy. So away from obviously fossil fuels, looking at the provider, or looking, sort of moving away from diesel to battery or alternative fuels. So I think that's a real good opportunity where you could probably make a change relatively quickly as well. So I think it's actually, sort of taking stock of, sort of the energy that you're using, and actually sort of where sort of where you can actually make changes relatively quickly. So I think one of the things from what I would say is that sort of pace and scale of change needs to increase for us to kind of sort of meet those kind of the targets around global warming. So I think actually, sort of moving to renewable energy where possible, I think is really a really good sort of first step. And I think equally then, sort of touching on Rohan, was with regards to travel. So obviously in the industry, it's that travel is a big one. I think it's starting to look at some of the obvious areas where you can make those changes, and I think it's really to drive that change quickly.
Yeah, and renewables, how are you finding that with if you've got vendors in other countries? Is that sort of regions dependent and to some extent?
It is absolutely. There are challenges depending on sort of where they are in the world. We've got bureaus all over the world, so there are challenges depending on where you are. But I think it's actually sort of really looking at the opportunities as well. So around energy security is a big one. So actually, if there's the ability to use renewable energy, then actually kind of that gives us a degree of energy security, and actually sort of from the BBC's perspective about keeping services on air. So I think there's still a lot to do in that area, but I think there's some great opportunities.
Thank you. Yeah, and it's just reminded me about the new contract you have, Matt, at Albert with renewable energy for the industry as a whole to come together as like group buying kind of power around renewable energy. So that's quite exciting. Where do you see the opportunities coming from your perspective?
Yeah, so I think building on the sort of, I suppose, the last 12, 13 years of Albert, when Jane Millichip joined BAFTA as CEO last year, she kicked off a sort of review of Albert, actually. And so there's been a fantastic sort of piece of work that's been done over a number of months, resulted in a number of things, actually. And one of them was the climate action, or the screen industry's climate action blueprint. And that's sort of it's the industry's blueprint, right? And that's how Albert is going to sort of operate and focus over the next 2 to 3 years. And this is done in a number of ways via content and storytelling, which we sort of talked about earlier. And the power of film and TV, which will really engage audiences and will drive change. It will absolutely drive change. Measurement and reporting, I think it's really interesting. Again, it's a point of like not being able to stand still, because things change all the time and you're having to bring people with you. And again, that's another brilliant aspect of Albert, is that we have these forums, we have these relationships, and actually we can bring people with us at speed. So that's a really important point. That sort of culture and capability. So a big part of Albert is how do you build on progress? Well, training has to adapt and it has to evolve. I think COVID showed us overnight that we could operate in a remote fashion. So a lot of training can be done, from either London to Australia, or from Sydney to London. Things like that have changed all. And then the final bit of the sort of kind of action blueprint is around sort of that off-screen actions. How can we talked a little bit about air miles, Rohan, just now, but what can we do to reduce our footprint? What can do we need to take that flight? Can we take the train when there aren't strikes? How can we minimize those footprints, really? And what can we do around materials and waste? That around us, it's sort of a more circular. And I know the BBC are doing lots, ITV are doing lots as well. I've been in those conversations. But I was having these conversations literally in 1999, when I think I first, was in the BBC. It's like, why are we still talking in the same way? And in some ways, we sort of gone backwards, haven't we? Because, you know, I remember BBC Props and Wigs in, you know, I think in West London, in Acton, it used to have everything and it was sort of all recycled. I sort of feel like what's happened, you know, what has happened that we sort of haven't retained that element. And this isn't a, you know, criticism of the BBC. I absolutely love it. It's just more about like, what have we done? What's changed? And actually, how can we get back into that circular thinking?
I think there's some great examples of circularity in parts of the industry, and some really, particularly in supply chain as well, that we're seeing. But in terms of the footprint now of an hour of TV, and I know you measure that every year, is it still I think the last time I looked, it was accommodation and travel and transport, crew transport, like on location basically, that's really driving a lot, which is sort of, you know, why there's a lot of opportunities in what Rohan was saying around remote production and also virtual production and all of those things. Is that still the case?
Yeah, I think absolutely. You
Yeah.
know, fuel no doubt is like the biggest. I don't want to say this is my phrase. It's Phil Holgate's from ITV, but he talks about pixels, not people, moving pixels, not people. And I just think, oh my God, that is so clever in a way, because that is exactly what we could do. And I remember being in a conversation, you know, during COVID, thinking, how are we going to film this piece to camera that we really need? And, you know, we couldn't go anywhere because it was COVID and it was lockdown. And actually it was sending a mobile phone on a courier through somebody's letterbox. It didn't need anyone there because we could do it ourselves. So, you know, I think it's just thinking about different ways. And one of the other things that I suppose I hear more and more from suppliers is lead times, just longer lead times. You know, think about it, stop knee-jerking, plan your time. You know, it can reduce then the unnecessary fuel waste. You can get on the right train, or you can put everyone on one flight rather than a number of flights. So yeah, I think we're definitely building on progress, but there is more to do in all of this.
Yeah, I mean, I've experienced that in terms of the desire to have better forward planning. When I was at Deluxe, sometimes we'd get content so late to the theatrical release date that, you know, everything would have to be air freighted around a country, you know, as big as America, because otherwise it wouldn't get there on time if it was hard drive. And, you know, like moving to IP delivery obviously helps that hugely. But if some content still needs to go on a hard drive and it can't get however many miles it needs to get, it gets put on because there's not enough time. The release window is so fixed for the theatre, as you know, then the things get put on aeroplanes. So yeah, I think some collaboration around that, changing the workflows so that we can work most sustainably and optimize the opportunities that we've got to do things the right way. That sounds
but that's change, Dee, isn't it? And I think change is terrifying at times, especially when you're working at speed. And that's a process change that you've got to try to incorporate into your business, and who's going to manage it. And, you know, and I think people are up for it as long as it's really clear and it's not just flung in.
Yeah, agreed. And I think change around an artistic process is often difficult as well, when you've got creative minds in a room that want that, you know, that the artistic creation that's been worked on for many, many years to be absolutely perfect. The last bit of that distribution chain can always get squeezed because it's in the cutting room, you know, for longer than anticipated or whatever. So that brings me on basically, so we're starting to get into some of the challenges, which is kind of where I wanted to move to next. You know, challenges to moving away from the tried and tested and the known business models. And what do you all see as being the key challenges we're going to face over the coming years to make proper progress, like really to move the needle? What is it? Is it infrastructure? Is it the lack of common standards? Is it a mindset thing? Is it, you know, tech? Or what do you see as being the big kind of hurdles we need to get over? Alison, I'm going to come to you first on this.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's again that buy-in within the organisation. I think sort of the realisation of the importance. As I say, we've kind of, you know, the conversations I have, people are recognising that, you know, it brings a commercial advantage you know, so they're really kind of, you know, starting to see that. I think it is that challenge, that buy-in within an organisation, and actually the realisation that sustainability is really important. I think it's actually, you know, what is the impact of climate change on the organisation, and actually the programs that are being made, and actually, you know, sort of where you are in the world as well. So I think it's kind of sort of factoring in those risks associated with with that, but equally the impact that you have as an organisation on the environment. So it's kind of that two-pronged attack. But I think it's, really understanding the, that climate change potentially could, very much change the way that we're going to have to work and operate as time progresses. So I think it is getting that realisation with an organisation, the buy-in and the commitment to drive and make change, and not to be seen as kind of that, second class compared to, sort of day-to-day operations. So I think it's, it's definitely a challenge, but I think actually we're starting to see that kind of that dial shift. And I think there will be that tipping point when you can see organizations that if they don't make those changes, they're going to get left behind. So I think that's kind of, really good, sort of, really valuable to see that that's starting to take shape. I was just going to touch on the technology side as well, that we're starting to see technology suppliers are really starting to progress in this area. We're having a conversation around about sort of changing lighting. So, sort of when just the way that you look and view and see programs, can have an impact on sort of the energy consumption. So I think there's kind of really looking at how technology can assist. I'm not a technology expert by any means, but I think it's actually realizing, sort of what technology is out there that can actually have a change in this area. So I think there's some good progression in that area as well.
Yeah, we've got plenty of technology experts in this industry, so hopefully we should be able to crack that one between us. But I'm really glad you mentioned risk there, because it seems like when people start to look at a climate transition plan and look at managing the risk of climate change for a corporation and looking at the scenarios of different levels of warming and what impact that has on the company, all of a sudden, it's very clear that the risk to the business as a whole from all different angles of what's happening in the world around us. So I think risk, leveraging risk, that risk assessment and risk process is going to be really key to getting to what Rohan was talking about earlier, which is building an ESG decision making throughout the core business. Because if you see the wider impact it could potentially have, then it means everybody needs to be kind of cognizant of it and what they're doing.
Yeah.
So yeah, thank you. Rohan, what have you experienced?
I think it's mindset, a general mindset, and people being involved and on this journey. I think there's still, it only seems to be there's not a huge groundswell across this, because we all know that we see what's going on outside, but it's actually going forward. There's a lot more. It's the education of that. And I'll revert back to BAFTA Alba again, and the other resource that they've got is great, which is the free training that you do. And that is, we have everybody, our freelancers and our employees, go and use this resource. It's great. It's 2 hours, and it's really useful, just so you can get that idea of what the impact of climate change is. Because some people, with media out there, you can't always get the straight answers. So it's actually that sort of mindset change of getting people on board and saying this is what we need to work together. I think one of the other things, just going back to some of the tech stuff that we've done, we've seen since there was definitely a leap of faith with some of our clients during COVID, because they were like that. Okay, we had Project Restart when we were going back with the Premier League and all of our sports, and we're like, well, we can't actually do it in the traditional way that we've done before, because we need the 2 meter spacing, and that was really the accelerator to say, right, okay, well, we'll have to, how do we think about this, doing these productions differently? And then so our clients were really got on board and said, okay, let's do it, because otherwise, we need to get that content on air. So, and now we're in a sort of a second phase of our sort of remote journey, where we've sort of built a brand new, last year, 4 brand new smaller remote trucks. They're like a third of the size of our, the large triple expanding Arctic lorries you see parked up in car parks around the UK, and they're a third of the size. They take a third of the power, but they're just as powerful, because not only that, because it's doing remote production, but there's there's different suppliers out there now that will do like a hyper converged design systems integration, where you have a lot smaller box that that will do everything, do multiple things in one box instead of having racks and racks of space. So using technology in that way, because it's bringing efficiencies to site, and that's how we're doing that. So I think that's one of the things we've seen a change, and it's that, okay, that's great, and then but how do we use technology again going forward to bring forward those efficiencies?
Thank you, Rohan. And Matt, have you seen from your perspective any, what are the big challenges? And I know you've only been in post a short amount of time, but you met a lot of people in that time, I know. So yeah, are there common challenges that everyone's facing?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's something that Alison said around that buy-in around commercial advantage, which I think is really interesting, because I sense that our viewers, viewers of our content, of the stuff that we're all creating, are expecting more and more from the content providers to be more sustainable, to be more environmentally conscious. And it's they're starting to ask questions, and I'm just thinking about, Rohan, about your trucks just then. I almost want to put an Albert sustainable logo on the back saying this truck is more sustainable by 30%, whatever it is, because I think that there are so many brilliant things that people are doing across our industry they're just not necessarily noticed or aware of. And I think it's just about championing those things, championing the good where we can, because there's so much negativity in the world, isn't there? So yeah, I think for me, just it all boils down to time, money, better understanding, and being really aware that we're not talking in an echo chamber to each other, that we're always projecting out. That would be, if we can break that challenge, that would be really, really good.
Well, actually, this is a good start, and I know that RTS are thinking of doing another session like this later on in the year, more focused on solutions for the future. So that's good. So finally, we've got 5 minutes left. This time has absolutely run by. So I just want to finish off by sort of asking you, if we're thinking about not being in an echo chamber, but being an ecosystem as an industry where we're all dependent on one another, and all the different parts of our community interact with one another, how can we start to get everyone prepared? And Alison, like you've touched on this quite a bit, which is helpful, because I see that some of the larger companies and some smaller companies well, but generally the larger companies are getting more well-defined paths and targets in place towards net zero. They're getting investor pressure, they're getting customer pressure, regulatory pressure, and they're committing resources and teams to work on what it looks like, what the plan is, what the footprint is, and they're leading the way, which is great, which I'm sure is how it works in many other industries as well. But we've also got this long tail of supply chain vendors, SMEs, and others. Some of them in different sizes of companies working across different sectors that perhaps we could also share and collaborate with. But sometimes when I think about it, it feels so big to tackle. Like, how can we make sure everyone's prepared and with us on this journey, quickly, without too much of a heavy lift for everybody? I don't know, Alison, I'm going to throw that pretty impossible question to you.
Yeah, it's a tricky question. I don't think we've got the solution to it. I think there's a recognition that SMEs really needs sort of that support, engagement, but equally they have the ability to drive and make changes. Probably it's at pace as well. So it's quite an interesting place to be. We've worked closely with a number of SMEs who work with the BBC just to kind of get a feel for some of the challenges. I think really education is really key, because we talk in certain terms, and it's kind of like, well, what does that mean? Sort of what are you after? And so there are some really good resources on there. Rohan sort of touched on the UK Business Climate Hub, or the SME Climate Hub. I think actually there's some really good resources out there for people to start to, just where do we start? So I think education and awareness are really, really important. But I think it's that sort of picking on Matt's conversations around, you know, sort of really showcasing what's working well. I don't think people necessarily sort of shout about it too much as well. So, you know, sort of what is the forum for people to really put out there some of the good examples that that they're working on. So I don't think there's yet the ideal solution, but I think actually there's some real drive and enthusiasm, particularly sort of from the SME sector, about sort of what they can do and actually sort of, you know, how quickly they can start to make changes. So it's definitely a space to watch.
Thank you. Yeah, that's great to hear. I feel like we've covered a lot in just under an hour, and I've got 3 minutes left. I'm just going to throw out some words of things that I've scribbled down here that of things that we've talked about that personally I don't want to forget. So it may be helpful for anyone who joined halfway through. But we talked about working together at speed. Thank you, Matt. I didn't like that phrase. And the importance of collaboration, convening, working together, having there's a sense of a willingness to talk about this. And there's not like moving away from the fear and more to the kind of action, which is great to hear. We talked about measuring, controlling, reducing. Thanks, Alison, around, you know, not sort of poring over the detail too much of a carbon footprint, but focusing on where you can start to make some real impact. We talked about building ESG into core business decisions. Rowan, I think that's really key for everybody. And when we start to do that, then we will actually start to see some picking up of the pace of action. Then we talked about opportunities in remote production and for reducing footprints, for opening up new technologies, and getting our clients to take a leap of faith, as they did in COVID times, towards working in new ways. Opportunities around renewables as potentially a quick win, travel, transport, and then the whole Albert sort of new climate blueprint around storytelling, content, measuring and reporting, educating, training all around the world, and all of the off-screen actions that we can do around waste and materials and energy and other things. And then we looked at getting buy-in with an organisation as being key to making progress. You know, looking at what's the impact of the progress that you can make, looking at risks, how to factor in risk into the storytelling in a corporate sense to get leadership support and influence. We talked about celebrating and championing the good things that are happening out there. Shifting mindsets, as Rowan was talking about, working with people in authority, trying to create a common sort of framework for education, building on the opportunity of commercial advantage. Matt, you touched on that, and all the sort of new innovations out there. It feels like we're in a really good place to make some really positive progress after that conversation. I'm feeling very optimistic. And I just wanted to say thank you to you all. We don't have time for any more conversation. No, I'm sure I've got plenty more questions I'd love to ask you all. But please, people online listening in, look out for the second event, which is coming up towards the end of the year, which will be more forward-looking in terms of the opportunities here. But I do want to thank you all. Thank you very much, Rowan, Matt, Alison, for joining us this evening. Thanks to Jonathan and Mark for being the tech support. I really look forward to continuing this discussion. It's such an important one, and I know there's many others out there having it as well. So more collaboration coming. And yeah, wishing you all a lovely evening. Thanks for joining.